20th century Dundee, a modern city, a city with a busy pedestrianised centre surrounded by equally busy roadways. So much has changed in Dundee, not just the people, but the very fabric of the city itself. These early monuments to the information age, for example, have found new uses, while for others the struggle for survival has just begun. Today's news is tomorrow's memory, gone but not forgotten, for now we can relive the past. This is the Whitehall Theatre in Belfield Street. Before the age of television, this is where our parents, grandparents and the like came to be entertained and to keep themselves informed of what was happening in the world through the medium of film. But it's not Jean Harlow or Douglas Fairbanks Jr. we've come here today to see. I'd like to introduce you to something a little more interesting. This is George Stout from Monifieth. Morning, George.
Good morning, David. Welcome to Dundee.
Isn't it wonderful, the old atmosphere in this theatre?
Well, let me tell you a bit about it before we commence the film show. I knew it, first of all, when it was the Alhambra in the 1930s. It was then a theatre and a cinema. And then in 1940, it was taken over by the Pennycook cinema chain in Dundee and was rechristened the State. It remained a cinema until the 60s, and then as cinema declined in Dundee, the town took it over and ran it as a variety theatre for another 10 to 15 years. And it looked then as if it was going to close altogether. But who should come along to the rescue but the public? And by public subscription, enough money was raised so that the theatre should continue, this time with the amateurs performing. And there is a trust which ensures that this carries on. The name Whitehall was curiously enough given to it by the Lord Provost of the time, Mr. Mackenzie, because he lived in Whitehall Crescent. So there is no real connection between the Whitehall here and the Whitehall in London, except that this theatre also never closed.
George, tell me about your father.
Well, the Stout family came to Dundee around the start of the century. And as a family business, they opened a chain of fish shops, one by one. Now, my father had been quite an athlete before the war, but unfortunately was badly shot up. He was in the artillery. And subsequently, his athletic activities were severely limited, really, to swimming. So he took up photography and became very interested, particularly in cinema photography. And one of the reasons I think why he was so successful at this was because he was comparatively immobile with a bad leg. And so he let the action happen all round about him, instead of, like so many amateurs, running around with a camera and using it like a paintbrush, taking everything in sight.
But what did he use for all this?
Well, let me show you. This is the Kodak K, which was brought out by Kodak Company in the early 30s. It's quite a simple camera. It's a clockwork motor, takes 100 feet of 16mm film, and most of the films you will see today were in fact shot with this camera.
Brilliant.
And there we are.
Just like that.
Just like that.
Do you think we could see some of the films?
Let's go. Well, this is the High Street in City Square, July 1935, and there's been quite a big crowd there because there was a parade by the 2nd Battalion of the Black Watch. There's the City Square, which had only been open for about 3 years by that time. Samuel's store, which looks rather similar even today. A Hindford Street tram. There's Dundee's tallest policeman, George Wilson, who was 6'8", and behind him a group of 3. The middle one was Bill Smith, who owned the Tivoli Theatre. This is now up at the Albert Institute, and looking at Rabyburn's statue and the railings which decorated the square at that time. They were all taken down during the war, of course. It's rather a nice peaceful scene with all the mature trees and the fountain, which again has gone. And now we're with George West, who was a friend of my father's. He had a watch repair business at the top of the hill town. And notice the bowler hat, which was worn by many of the businessmen in the 30s. Yeah. Fine Ken speckled figure, George was. Nice watch chain, which adorns his waistcoat, and his assistant. And now down to the docks. This in fact is the Victoria dock, and this was the home of the DP&L ships which sailed regularly to London. Before the war you could make a trip to London for 25 shillings. The London was the largest ship and the smaller one was the Fair City. And this is the tidal basin where the sprat boats came in, and all gone now. The Victoria Arch in the background. And all this area has been filled in, of course, for the approach roads to the bridge. The harbour light, which is the only relic from that period. And we're now down at the Eastern Wharf, the unloading of jute from a British India liner. And at the fish dock, the fish curing family, the Cools, who were well known at that time. Now that was the Tumby, one of the Dundee trawlers belonging to Cameron MacFarlane. Bill Carnegie, fishmonger, who had a business up at Stobbs Well. And notice the chimneys of the Carolina electricity station in the background. Now there we have a ship sailing down the river, a city line boat I think, and belching plenty of smoke. Otherwise the grassy beach looks about the same. Probably fewer yachts at anchor now than there would be today. Our principal shop was at 191 Princess Street. Note the heavy message bike and the big fish boxes. Stouts for quality and keenest prices. We also had a shop in the Ferry Road, which we closed during the war because we couldn't get a sufficient allocation of fish at what was then a very scarce time. That is my mother serving behind the counter. Eggs, 1 and 3 a dozen. And a delivery of fish with the lorry driver, Richard Duncan. Pretty hard job and heavy job carrying these boxes. They weighed well over 10 stone with 8 stone of fish in them, and guaranteed a hernia at some time or another. And now down to the Castle Green for Coronation Day. Bright sunny day and lots of entertainment. Two young girls performing a tap dance. Tap dancing, of course, in the days of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, very popular. And I always remember this girl sang and danced to There's Something About a Soldier, which was the Cicely Courtnage favourite of the time. And then the inevitable comedy duo in the style of Harry Gordon and Jack Holden. Swagger of the kilt, and then they're off. And the inevitable love song, perhaps, to accordion accompaniment. the pipes and drums, and the maids of the day. And note the dresses, although this was a lovely warm day, obviously the ladies were taking no chances and were well wrapped up. And that's the harbour at Broughty Ferry, which looks pretty well unchanged today. Alec Leeper, a family friend, having had his Sunday morning swim and putting on his suspenders, and his employer at the fish market, Donald McFarlane. And a shot taken down on the sands where pre-war one was able to get out in the rowing boats for threepence or sixpence, and if you were very good and you were young, you occasionally got to take an oar. Many folk in the ferry will remember these days with affection. Army parades of all kinds were very popular during the 30s, partly because there was a recruiting campaign going on for the territorials, and this is one such gathering in the Baxter Park. The park having been gifted to the town by Sir David Baxter in the 1860s. And now we're off to the army camp at Barry. Again, territorials and regulars came to the Barry camps, and in these days you would see they lived under tents. I think these were Argyll Southern Highlanders. And not only did they have the usual run of sports in these days, but they also had dancing by the regular forces. And now off to the heavies and the tug of war, and it looks as if the fellows on the left are going to lose this one. Yep. And now the gymnast display team. Again, these were very popular pre-war. A lot of amateur bodies had these gymnastic display teams. The Wardrobe Gym in Dundee was a place where they used to perform in the 1920s and 30s. And now to the real heavies and throwing the hammer. And I look at this now in some horror because my father was busy taking these pictures and there's no indication of where that hammer might go. No protective nets in these days. This fellow was a British Army champion. I think he's going to be last in that particular race. And the show finishes off with the good old Highland fling. The Arbroath bathing pool was a favourite spot for us in the 30s. It was completed in 1934, opened by the Earl of Strathmore. It was a very large pool indeed. It could accommodate 1,200 swimmers and 4,000 spectators. It was 300 feet long and 90 feet broad. And I think, apart from Portobello, was probably the largest outdoor pool in the country. But if you know Arbroath, Guy called on a Saturday or a Sunday there, but obviously when this was taken it was a nice summer's day and a good turnout. The pool was closed during the war, in fact was designated as a mortuary. Then it reopened in the late 40s and 50s and so on, and carried on until 1980, when unfortunately By that time its revenues were £3,500 and its cost £70,000 per annum. And I'm afraid that was the end of the pool. And now to the riverside, or as we knew it, as the Cowp, and an early demonstration of flying by Sir Alan Cobham's circus. Cobham was very interested in the promotion of commercial aviation, and he brought some stunt flyers to Dundee, and he also brought a couple of airliners which took people on flights. This is one of them. They were Handley Page airliners, took 20 passengers. And he pronounced after this show that the riverside was completely unacceptable for civilian flying, which of course has been proved wrong. And he suggested that the Dundee Council should buy some ground about 6 or 9 miles from Dundee. That's a lady pilot, Joan Meakin, flew a sailplane. Now to Forfar, and we start off here with an exhibition fight with Benny Lynch, who was the world flyweight champion in the white vest, and Johnny McGrory, 2 weights heavier at featherweight, who was a British champion. And this is an exhibition match. You see they're barely touching each other. Very fine boxers. And you'll note, of course, being Forfar, there's plenty of flat caps around. Bowler hats and Homburgs would certainly be out of place there. Another exhibition match between Jake Coleraine, who was a British champion at middleweight, Johnny McMillan, who was a Scottish champion at welterweight. And again, you see there are very few punches being traded. But then a real scrap between Jim Brady of Dundee and Mickey Summers of Dundee, a closely matched pair of bantamweights who fought many a hard fight. Summers was unfortunately drowned during the war on the HMS Barham, but Jim Brady became British and British Empire champion. And now Jim Cowie, who fought at lightweight, and his claim, dubious claim to fame, was that while boxing in a booth in Aberdeen, he was knocked out by the Duke of Hamilton.
Ah.
Skating at clay pots, a favourite occupation, pastime in winter. Clay pots pond could be flooded quite easily to a depth of maybe 6 inches or so, and got some fine skating there in pre-war days. And that's my sister and my brother with the cap, and he's pulling me. In these days, of course, we didn't have the skating boots we have now. We had clamped skates onto the sole of the boot. Notice that the men were skating and wearing +2s or +4s. That seemed to be the fashion of that time. Then this shot, and that follows, were taken in 1946-47. The rink, Dundee's ice rink, had been opened in 1938, and of course the standard of skating improved immeasurably. All the fancy twiddles and all the rest of it. And this, of course, makes the interest in skating so much greater, and the clay pots was very much busier than it had been pre-war. Dundee Football Club entertaining Third Lanark, club which became defunct in the 1950s. This is an interesting piece of film because this was Dundee's last season in the First Division pre-war. They were relegated at the end of the 1937 season, but on this occasion they beat Third Lanark 2-1 before a crowd of 15,000 people. Johnny Lynch in the goal, I think, that day, Archie Coates in the centre, Baxter, McMenemy, the inside forwards, and Carabine and Denmark playing for Third Lanark. Great names from the past. Dundee are in the darker jerseys. The May I and Mercury story is a very interesting one. In 1938, Mr. Robert Mayo, who was general manager of Imperial Airways, put together an attempt to break the long distance record of flying, and the ambition was to fly from the Tay to South Africa, which was over 6,000 miles. That's the parent aircraft, the May I, and the smaller one, the Mercury, was to be put on top of it. The two were to take off as a joint aircraft, and then the Mercury was to be detached and fly solo for its 6,000 mile venture. This was them loaded before they eventually flew off in October 1938. My father was taken round the boat that day by the Cameron McFarlane brothers. And that's Eric McFarlane, the youngest of the McFarlanes, who owned the boat. The detachment was supposed to take place over the Law at Dundee, but that really was quite dangerous. And so, although a crowd gathered to see this, all they saw at the end of the day was the May I returning. I believe that the separation took place somewhere about Forfar. And that's October 1938. And so it's down the Clyde to see the speed trials of the Queen Mary. My father with a friend was on the ferry boat, one of the many sailing the Clyde at that time, and sailing down river to see the mighty Queen Mary. Queen Mary keel was laid in 1930, and after various hiccups was launched in 1934 and completed in the spring of 1936. And there she was, magnificent liner, quite the largest afloat at that time, 81,000 tons, to be exceeded by the Queen Elizabeth a few years later, which was 83,000 tons.
Beautiful ship.
Yes, fine ship. And of course you can still see her today at Long Beach, California, which is a prime exhibit. On these speed trials, the ship did, I think, 32 knots, which is about 37 miles an hour. And of course, during the war, it was converted into a troop ship. And having entertained 2,000 passengers, it then entertained 16,000 servicemen. It sailed without escort across the Atlantic many times during the war. Well, also on view that day was this burnt-out hulk, the L'Atlantique, which was a 42,000 ton French liner, which unfortunately was in service for only 18 months. It was on the South American run, but came to grief and became a wreck, and then was towed up to the Clyde for breaking up. Sad sight.
Yes.
And the ferry boats around the various ships that day on the Clyde, and you can see this one is very, very full indeed.
Goodness me.
And that's a rare shot of my father and his friend Ben McMahon, who was also in the fish trade. This is the Homeric. ship for breaking up at Inverkeithing. And 2 points of note about it. Some of the panelling went into the Regal Cinema in Dundee, and the dance floor of the Locarno was also taken from the Homeric. Friendly warships used to appear in the Forth and Tay at that time, particularly in the Forth. And these shots are of interest because they were of the class of battleship that were severely pummeled by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. These were the Arkansas and the Wyoming, neither of which actually were at Pearl Harbor, but others of that class, the Ohio, the Arizona, the California, were either sunk or severely damaged in that dreadful day in December 1941. This would have been taken about 1935. Notice the very broad beam of these ships.
Yes.
And that's me at the back. Never one of the best sailors. My mother and my sister. A novel way to go aboard a ship. Not something you'd want to do on a dark night after you've had a few pints, I would think. And now down the Clyde again. This is 38, and we're seeing some of the traffic there, including the Queen Elizabeth, which was still on the stocks but due to be launched that year. These are some cargo boats. Another of the ferry boats, that's a paddler, you can see. It's another one. And there's the Queen Elizabeth, shortly before it was launched. And the large cranes, only one of which is now still there to be seen on the Clyde. These destroyers were for the Argentine Navy, apparently. A huge bulk of the Queen Elizabeth, which sadly ended its days in Hong Kong Harbour. This was good fun. It was a team event to run round Dundee. It started down at near the Craig Pier and set off up South Union Street, which doesn't really exist now, all the way to the ferry where there was a changeover. And this is the junction of Brook Street and Grey Street, which looks pretty well the same today. And then on the Kingsway, that's Ken Shaw, who was the Scottish heavyweight boxing champion, on the left. And here are the teams changing over. Ken Shaw again. Notice how quiet the roads were in these days. Still petrol rationing, of course. And the next changeover was at Invergowrie. The Hawkhill Harriers would be representing Dundee, of course, at that time. And there would be some army teams and some representatives from the west. This is the changeover at Invergowrie, and Jim Brannan, who was Dundee's famous runner of the period. And the little fellow coming into focus is Dunkie Wright, who was a Scottish cross-country champion. And here's the last group now coming into Riverside, George McLean's garage, which is about where Discovery Point is now. For this piece of film I'm indebted to the late Jimmy Bruce of W.G. Grant and Company, the jute company. This is very interesting because it does show what happened in the arrival of jute in Dundee and its carriage up to the mills and some of the processing of jute. And this of course is again down at the harbour, either the Eastern Wharf or the King George V Wharf, and the unloading of the bales of jute from India onto lorries or horse-drawn vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the haulage contractors of course disappeared with the decline in the jute industry, but Callender of Forfar was a name that survived. Many a bale was not what it seemed because some of them contained lumps of iron.
Oh.
And if you were a good jute broker, you knew the best firms to deal with in India who were liable to be trustworthy. Fine sight seeing these horses going along Dock Street. And if there were W.G. Grant's supplies, then they were going all the way up to Constitution Street,
Mm-hmm.
which meant climbing halfway up the law to get there.
Indeed.
And I think they went in a fairly devious way. I think they went up Victoria Road and then cut back up Main Street, then down the hill town and along into Constitution Street. And this is the arrival at the W.G. Grant Works. These horses certainly earned their keep.
Indeed they did.
And storage of bales, and each bale of course was manhandled into the spinning mill. And this is where they break down the fibre into a situation where it can be used for spinning.
Dusty work.
Very dusty work. And many of the women, in fact most of the women, used to wear hairnets or handkerchiefs over their heads. In the jute industry, of course, there were many more women employed than men. Men mainly were doing the heavy work, or in fact were the mechanics who kept the machines running. But the operatives were almost certainly women. And that's old James Bruce, the father of the Jimmy Bruce that I knew. He was the patriarch of the firm. Now this is the extension of the factory at Constitution Street, and you'll see some of the building methods look a bit archaic compared with what goes on today. Barrow is well in evidence. Now here are the Bruce brothers, with I think with the architect. It's Tom Bruce, who was the senior director, and his brother David, and Jimmy, of course, would be taking the pictures. Again, as we near completion, sweeping up taking place. And old Mr. Bruce making an inspection just to see that everything was in working order.
Indeed.
Now just a little bit of pre-war skating on Stormont Loch near Blairgowrie, with Aileen and Muriel Farquharson and David Baxter. So it's rather similar to the skating we had at Claypots, only there's a great expanse of water, and it's a favourite place for curling on those winters when we can get some ice. This would be again just in the late 30s, because you see the ice hockey sticks are to the fore, and ice hockey didn't really become popular here until it was introduced into the ice rinks in the late 30s, both Perth and Dundee and other places. An interesting shot, this Maryfield Curling Pond, which was the home of the Dundee Curling Club. And there were many of these clubs around in pre-war days, but of course when the ice rink was built in 1938, they all went indoors where they could get regular ice from September through to March. It's sad to relate that hardly anybody remembers anyone on this film. I think that old chap was called Willie Bruce. Well garbed for the occasion. And of course, one of the advantages of the outdoor rink was on the slightest bit of frost, you could just hose it down with a ½ inch of water and you had some curling. And now we switch to an outdoor bonspiel, I think at Rossi Priory. It is interesting to reflect on the change in the weather pattern nowadays. We haven't had a grand match, for example, where the South play the North at curling since 1979. And in the 19th century, you could almost guarantee a grand match every 3 or 4 years. So it does indicate that our winters are much more mild than they used to be.
Curling as a sport is declining.
Oh no. On the contrary, curling is very popular in the ice rinks.
Right.
The difficulty about curling is that it's not really a profitable enterprise. It's very expensive to create rinks specifically for curlers. The roaring game, as they call it, and certainly if you're outside, as I was lucky to be at the 1979 Grand Match, the noise of the stones running across the ice is quite fantastic. There's a line of cars from the curlers. And the end of the match, and the curlers taking their stones away for another day. And that's what you do. You pull them across the ice. You never lift them and carry them, because that could be highly dangerous if you slip. And now we move inside, so it's 38 or 39. And what is amusing, of course, to modern curlers is the attire of, you might deem, our fathers. It looks as if they appeared straight from their work. They're still in their suits, whereas we have all the fancy garb and the special shoes and all the gear. It's even more curious now when one sees some curlers smoking on the ice, because that would be prohibited nowadays. You would never be allowed to smoke on the ice. And now the presentation of prizes at the Dundee rink. Unfortunately, for a few years past we haven't been able to enjoy this because we have no Dundee ice rink, but perhaps that will come again someday.
Some cleaning of the silver needed there in some household.
Oh yes, yes. Very nice to have some of these trophies, I can tell you. And then, of course, no presentation is complete without supping from the cup.
Of course. Where did we forget to do that?
We still do it in the golf clubs, I can tell you.
Well, George, that's amazing. I mean, all these memories. How many people watching this can remember those, do you think?
Well, I think a lot of my school chums will remember this. And for me, no trip down memory lane would really be complete without going back and having a look at my old school, the Morgan Academy. I remember the first two lines of the school song. Hail the Morgan stately splendour, jail the teachers every one. Let's go and see if there are any teachers still in that jail. Well, there's the Morgan in all its glory, David.
George, it's a wonderful building.
It's a wonderful building.
What a place to go to school.
And well, I was there from 1939 to 45. We had some enjoyable times then, and some not so enjoyable, of course.
Some very fond memories then for you.
Some good memories. And I think what I'll show you now is some footage of the Morgan sports and some of the rugby games. I think you'll enjoy these.
That would be good.
Good.
Excellent.
We'll go off and do that. Well, this was 1943, a rather wet day. Doug McAllister winning the mile, but Charlie Elder, the French teacher, wasn't enjoying it, and neither was Dr. Collier, the rector. However, another year and things looked a bit brighter. This is the intermediate hockey dribble for girls. Bob Peden, our mass master, was officiating over that. There he is with his very prominent bald spot. And this is the senior hockey dribble. Irene McIntosh in centre stage there. And now some of the juniors in the three-legged race. Mr. Stewart, English master, Dr. Colley from the chemistry department, and my future wife running hard in the left-hand lane there to win the 100 yards in the senior girls. Some more of the junior department. Now the intermediate boys. My dentist, Mr. Cathro. Visits to him were never really very pleasant. The relay race once round the track, and that seems to be me picking up the baton on the inside lane. Some family friends, Captain Rennie, who lived on the Kingsway, and his wife and 2 children. And now we come to the mile, where most folk would have a go. Ron Powrie, Peter Grant, Bill Young, Andy Kroll, Jimmy Miller, and Jimmy Leyburn trying to get the extra yard. This was a good race to see if Peter Grant could win all 4 of the track events. And here he is in the lead on the second last lap, but beaten by Bill Young on the run-in. 1947 was a grand year, and here we have the pillow fight with Ken Urquhart, Brian Devine, and Fraser Fife lashing about him in good style. And building up to a big climax with Fraser Fife and Jim Thau in the final, with Dr. Colley and Mr. Peden officiating. And a win for Fraser. And now some rugby with the FBs playing the present pupils, and the present pupils with the hooped shirts, and the FPs with a rather motley collection of shirts, because this was still the days of clothes rationing. Hugh Kerr, who was a well-known rugby player and later a golfer in the area. And it's Hugh to the fore there. And note the prefabs in the back, which long outlived their 20 years expected life. Ernie Landsman, who was a PT teacher, was officiating that day. And Hugh Kerr again kicking off. And we finish this sequence with a visit to the building of the Tay Road Bridge in 1965. This was now being built on the grounds of the docks, the Earl Grey Dock, King William the Dock, and the tidal basin that we saw earlier on this film. And this visit was arranged by Jeff Morris, who was the consultant engineer for members of the Dundee Round Table. And this is us setting out on our evening visit, by which time most of the work had ceased for the day. Ian Anderson with the pipe, and one of the staff, Bill Kidd, Jim Wilson, Martin McLaren with the bonnet, and notice, of course, that at this time the carriageway had not been completed. We were walking along the temporary platforms. Bill Young with a pipe, and the photographer himself shows up very briefly. That was the rescue boat in case of accidents, and at some points we had some quite narrow walkways to get from one point to another. And the piers, of course, were made from concrete, with the concrete being poured into temporary copper drams. two former tablers, Ernie Sutty and Bill Burns, both of whom have since passed on. But there's Harry Brough and Tom Pate, who are still well-kent figures around Dundee. Errol Burchell, who went off to Glasgow. And notice at the far end of the bridge here, a lot of work still had to be done. Fred Swanson, Errol Burchell and John McMahon sharing a toffee, and Jeff Morris leading the troops to the Fife side. It was quite remarkable that within a year this bridge would be complete. Other well-known faces, Ian Barr, Sinclair Aitken, Fred Swanson again. And that was the view from the Fife side, looking back towards Dundee. With a great deal of work still to be done at that side. And now it's 1966, opening day for the bridge, and the first traffic about to come over. These were the last days now of the Fifeys that had ploughed their way across the Tay in all weathers. One of the last acts of the Fifeys was to, in fact, take their spite out on the bridge and collide with it. And following the opening of the bridge by the Queen Mother in her car, this is the first of the traffic coming over.
And so to the present, or should I say the more recent past. There will be no shortage of opportunity to look back at today's generation. The advent of video has seen to that. But the old film stock we have seen today is special. John Stout captured history in the making, and his son George has made sure we can all enjoy it. Well, I hope you've enjoyed being with us once again in Auld Dundee. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself presenting this video, and I've enjoyed meeting the people we've met also. There's a few shots left yet as I play you out with a few tunes. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.